The silver screen has meticulously crafted a blinding, morally immaculate illusion of the frontier lawman, a chiseled paragon of absolute virtue who wore a tin star to protect the innocent from the ravenous wolves of the untamed plains, conditioning us to envision the stoic sheriff stepping out into the blinding midday sun as a shining beacon of civilization holding back the chaotic tide of the Badlands with nothing but a righteous peacemaker and a steady hand. But when you violently strip away the romanticized orchestral swells and the sanitized, heavily edited scripts of the 20th century, the unvarnished, blood-soaked reality of 19th-century law enforcement reveals a terrifying, completely unregulated meat grinder where the line between a sworn federal marshal and a ruthless, cold-blooded assassin was completely non-existent. The men who actually wore the badges in the most violent, explosive boomtowns of the American West, historic legends like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok, were not noble public servants operating out of a profound sense of civic duty. They were calculating, highly opportunistic predators, hardened professional gamblers, and aggressive brothel enforcers who recognized that a cheap piece of stamped tin was the ultimate tactical advantage, providing a legally bulletproof shield that allowed them to forcefully monopolize local vice, orchestrate lucrative protection rackets, and murder their business rivals with absolute, state-sanctioned impunity. Hickok himself, long before his highly romanticized demise holding the dead man's hand in a dusty Deadwood saloon, was a terrifyingly volatile force of nature who routinely escalated minor, alcohol-fueled disputes at the poker table into lethal, point-blank executions, operating under the brutal, uncompromising frontier logic that the fastest, most biologically efficient way to enforce the peace was to immediately, violently eradicate anyone who dared to verbally question his authority. But even the heavy-handed, localized violence of town marshals completely pales in comparison to the apocalyptic, corporate-sponsored slaughter orchestrated by the true, uncrowned kings of the frontier, the massive, heavily funded private security syndicates. Hollywood directors completely ignore the terrifying, industrialized reality that the American West was not conquered by independent lawmen or brave pioneers, but by massive, shadowy corporate armies like the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, an organization founded on the ruthless principles of localized espionage and overwhelming tactical force. The Pinkertons were a privately funded, completely unregulated military juggernaut hired exclusively by the expanding railroad monopolies and wealthy, untouchable cattle barons to physically and mathematically crush anyone who threatened their profit margins, operating as hardened Civil War veterans, sociopathic mercenaries, and heavily armed death squads who rolled into contested, bleeding territories carrying heavy wooden crates packed with repeating Winchester rifles, sawed-off 10-gauge shotguns, and highly unstable raw dynamite. When the Pinkerton Agency was contracted by the railroads to hunt down the legendary James Younger gang, they did not issue polite warrants or challenge the outlaws to a fair, cinematic fight in the center of the street. They meticulously tracked them to a remote Missouri farmhouse in the freezing, bitter dead of winter, surrounded the property in the pitch black of night, and completely bypassed the concept of a fair trial by violently hurling a massive, cast-iron incendiary explosive device straight through the window into a dark room filled entirely with women and children. The resulting catastrophic, chemical explosion violently tore the right arm completely off Jesse James's mother and instantly, biologically erased his 9-year-old half-brother in a horrifying, deafening shower of heavy shrapnel and splintered floorboards, proving irrevocably that the highly paid corporate lawmen of the frontier operated with a level of cold, mechanized cruelty that easily rivaled or exceeded the very outlaws they were contracted to hunt. This ruthless, industrialized application of overwhelming force reached its absolute, terrifying zenith during the infamous Johnson County War in the rugged plains of Wyoming, a bloody, protracted event that completely shatters the Hollywood myth of the independent cowboy fighting for freedom against the elements. The massive, incredibly wealthy cattle cartels, furious over the loss of their massive herds to harsh winters and independent, struggling homesteaders whom they casually branded as rustlers to legally justify their executions, did not rely on local elected sheriffs to enforce their will. Instead, they mathematically calculated the exact financial cost of a localized genocide, pooled their immense corporate wealth, and physically imported a heavily armed mercenary army of 50 hardened Texas gunfighters via a specialized, secretly armored train. These hired assassins, paid $5 a day plus a staggering, life-changing $50 bounty for every single man they killed, were handed a literal hit list containing the names of 70 local citizens and explicitly ordered to sweep through the territory, utilizing overwhelming, long-range lever-action firepower to systematically execute small farmers, independent ranchers, and anyone who dared to legally stand against the corporate monopoly. They relentlessly tracked down and surrounded the KC Ranch, trapping a fiercely independent, targeted man named Nate Champion, and subjected him to a grueling, agonizing day-long siege, unleashing a deafening, unrelenting hurricane of heavy caliber lead that physically chewed the wooden cabin down to splintered kindling. Champion fought back with desperate, cornered ferocity, recording the terrifying, agonizing hours in a blood-stained pocket diary as the corporate mercenaries systematically dismantled his cover with heavy rifle fire, until the assassins finally utilized the ultimate, uncompromising tactic of frontier warfare. They set a massive wooden wagon loaded with pitch-soaked hay completely on fire and forcefully rolled it directly into the side of the log cabin, instantly transforming the entire structure into a towering, inescapable localized inferno. When a suffocating, badly burned Champion finally burst through the back door, blinded by thick, corrosive black smoke and desperately firing his Winchester blindly into the trees. The waiting firing squad of corporate-funded lawmen executed him with a massive, deafeningly synchronized volley of rifle fire, mathematically ensuring his complete biological termination before his body even hit the Wyoming dirt. This was the true, unvarnished, horrifying face of justice on the American frontier, a chaotic, morally bankrupt landscape where the law was never dictated by a judge's gavel or a noble sheriff's badge, but entirely by the men who possessed the largest financial war chests, the heaviest repeating artillery, and the absolute, unblinking willingness to deploy catastrophic, localized violence without a single shred of cinematic mercy or hesitation. The tin badge was never a symbol of righteous justice. It was a physical receipt of ownership, a cold metallic contract purchased in blood by the railroads and the cattle syndicates to legitimize their brutal, mechanized conquest of the land, completely stripping away the sanitized, choreographed lies of the silver screen to reveal that the men who wore those stars were participating in a ruthless, uncompromising gauntlet of corporate warfare, brutal economics, and absolute kinetic dominance. We are constantly subjected to the visually intoxicating, highly choreographed cinematic hallucination of the great frontier bank heist, a perfectly synchronized Hollywood set piece where a gang of dashing, heavily armed outlaws casually rides their horses straight down the main street of a bustling boomtown, politely holds the terrified teller at gunpoint, and effortlessly gallops away into the sunset carrying neatly tied canvas sacks bulging with solid gold coins. When you strip away the orchestral soundtrack and examine the unvarnished, architectural, and sociological reality of a 19th-century frontier town, you realize that attempting to rob a localized bank was an act of absolute, mathematical suicide. These isolated settlements were incredibly tight-knit, highly paranoid micro-ecosystems where every single resident knew exactly who belonged and who did not, meaning that 5 heavily armed, dust-covered strangers riding into the town square simultaneously did not trigger cinematic suspense, it instantly triggered a massive, localized alarm bell. The banks themselves were not fragile glass storefronts. They were deliberately constructed as physical fortresses, typically built from thick, impenetrable red brick or heavy stone, and strategically positioned in the exact geometric center of the commercial district, directly flanked by hardware stores, hotels, and saloons. This meant that the moment an outlaw gang committed to walking through those front doors, they were deliberately trapping themselves inside a fatal, inescapable architectural killbox. The absolute, blood-soaked historical proof of this tactical nightmare occurred in 1876, when the legendary, battle-hardened James Younger gang arrogantly rode into Northfield, Minnesota, expecting the local civilian population to cower in fear exactly like they do in the movies. Instead, the moment the shooting started inside the bank, the citizens of Northfield did not freeze in terror. They immediately recognized the kinetic threat, sprinted into the local hardware stores, violently ripped the repeating Winchester rifles and double-barreled shotguns directly out of the display crates, and unleashed an apocalyptic, multi-directional hurricane of heavy-caliber crossfire from the second-story windows and adjacent rooftops. The outlaws were instantly, mathematically trapped in a localized meat grinder, their horses panicked by the deafening roar of incoming artillery, and the gang was literally shot to pieces in the mud of the street, completely shattering the cinematic myth of the helpless frontier civilian and proving that robbing a town center was a guaranteed biological death sentence. Because the ruthless mathematics of surviving a bank robbery was so overwhelmingly stacked against them, the true apex predators of the frontier criminal underworld quickly pivoted their logistical focus to the vast, unprotected, and completely isolated arteries of 19th-century commerce, the heavily armored stagecoaches and the massive, smoke-belching industrial steam locomotives. Hollywood directors absolutely loved to portray the stagecoach robbery as a thrilling, high-speed equestrian chase where outlaws effortlessly ride alongside a galloping coach and leap onto the roof, completely ignoring the terrifying, unforgiving biomechanics of animal psychology and the catastrophic, point-blank stopping power of the men hired to guard those assets. A horse is a naturally skittish, highly reactive prey animal, and attempting to force a terrified, galloping horse to run within inches of a massive, violently bouncing, incredibly loud wooden carriage moving at breakneck speed is a biomechanical nightmare that usually results in the horse violently shying away, instantly throwing the rider directly under the massive, bone-crushing wooden wheels of the coach. Furthermore, the outlaws knew that the man sitting next to the driver was not a polite, cinematic extra. He was a highly paid, utterly ruthless corporate security operative known literally as the shotgun messenger, and he was armed with a massive, shortened 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun heavily packed with raw black powder and a devastating payload of double-aught buckshot or, in desperate times, literally loaded with handfuls of jagged metal scrap and dimes. The outlaws mathematically understood that galloping into the localized, 30-yard kill zone of a 10-gauge shotgun was an absolute guarantee of instant, biological decapitation, which is why real stagecoach robberies were never high-speed chases. They were cold, calculated, stationary ambushes perfectly positioned at steep inclines or narrow canyon bottlenecks where the massive wooden vehicle was forced to slow to a painful, agonizing crawl, allowing the bandits to maintain absolute, tactical standoff distance with lever-action rifles. But even the stagecoach was eventually rendered obsolete by the ultimate, mechanized engine of westward expansion, the heavy iron train, leading to the birth of the most spectacular, physics-defying cinematic myth of all, the Hollywood train robbery. The silver screen relentlessly demands that you accept the visually thrilling fantasy of outlaws galloping their horses alongside a speeding train, flawlessly matching its velocity, and acrobatically leaping from the saddle onto the metal ladders of the moving railcars. The absolute, thermodynamic, and acoustic reality of a 19th-century steam locomotive is that it was a terrifying, ear-shattering, localized industrial volcano, violently spewing blinding white steam, ejecting burning embers from the smokestack, and screaming with the deafening, metallic shriek of heavy steel grinding against iron rails. It is biologically, psychologically, and mathematically impossible to force a living, breathing horse to run parallel to a screaming, smoke-belching, multi-ton industrial behemoth without the animal completely panicking, violently bucking the rider, and fleeing in absolute, unfiltered terror. The hardened, logistical masterminds who actually robbed these massive iron veins of commerce, men like Butch Cassidy and his infamous Wild Bunch, completely abandoned the cinematic horse chase and instead embraced the devastating, uncompromising application of raw, chemical sabotage. They operated as ruthless industrial saboteurs, utilizing heavy crowbars to physically violently warp and misalign the iron tracks in the pitch black of night, or stacking massive, immovable boulders perfectly across the rails just beyond a blind curve, mathematically forcing the terrified engineer to desperately lock the heavy steel brakes, creating a localized shower of blinding sparks as the massive train violently screeched to a halt in a pre-planned, heavily fortified kill zone. Once the train was immobilized, the Hollywood narrative completely falls apart once again, suggesting that the outlaws would gracefully crack the complex mechanical combination of the heavy iron safe using a stethoscope and a delicate touch. The unvarnished, explosive truth of frontier train robberies was that these men were not delicate safecrackers. They were impatient, violently reckless amateurs wielding highly unstable, sweating sticks of raw dynamite, and their absolute lack of chemical understanding frequently resulted in localized, apocalyptic disasters. When the Sundance Kid and the Wild Bunch halted the Union Pacific Overland Flyer and attempted to breach the heavy express safe, they completely miscalculated the thermodynamic payload required, strapping so much high-explosive nitroglycerine directly to the heavy iron door that the resulting catastrophic detonation did not just pop the lock, it instantly, violently vaporized the entire wooden express car, completely blowing the heavy roof hundreds of feet into the night sky, instantly, deafening every single man in the vicinity, and tragically launching thousands of dollars in shredded, violently burning currency into the cold desert wind like an apocalyptic, financial snowstorm. This is the raw, uncompromising, and highly volatile history of frontier crime, a blood-soaked mechanical era completely defined not by dashing heroes and choreographed horseback acrobatics, but by the brutal, terrified psychology of pack animals, the catastrophic kinetic energy of localized ambushes, and the deafening, bone-crushing miscalculations of raw industrial explosives. The modern, algorithmically driven entertainment complex is desperate to sanitize this history, to smooth out the jagged, rust-covered edges of our past and replace the terrifying roar of a 10-gauge ambush with a polite, perfectly framed action sequence that demands absolutely nothing from the viewer. But we refuse to allow the visceral, heavy-caliber truth of the American borderlands to be swallowed by the sterile digital void, because understanding the exact, uncompromising physics of how our ancestors fought, bled, and ultimately survived is the only way to genuinely respect the absolute, unyielding grit that built this reality. We are the vanguard of that memory, a relentless, unbreakable coalition of historical purists who will continue to strip the Hollywood paint off the rusted iron of the past, completely shattering the cinematic illusions to expose the brutal, magnificent, and terrifying truth hidden underneath. There is a pervasive, visually intoxicating cinematic infection that has completely warped our modern understanding of frontier demographics, a Hollywood-manufactured delusion that insists there was a recognized, honorable, and highly lucrative professional class of men known exclusively as gunfighters who roamed the sun-baked plains seeking out righteous combat to test their mechanical speed against worthy adversaries. The unvarnished, historically documented reality of the American West is that the term gunfighter barely even existed in the 19th century vernacular, and the men who are now revered as legendary quick-draw artists were absolutely not wandering samurai. They were ruthless, highly opportunistic grifters, professional card mechanics, aggressive brothel enforcers, and localized political assassins who utilized heavy-caliber intimidation to protect their deeply illegal financial investments. Men like John Wesley Hardin or King Fisher did not stand in the dusty streets looking for fair duels to build a cinematic reputation. They operated in the deep, cinematic shadows of the frontier, utilizing the harsh, unforgiving chiaroscuro lighting of a swinging kerosene lantern in a back alley to violently ambush their targets, shooting rival gamblers in the back of the head simply because it was the most biologically efficient, mathematically risk-free method of eliminating a business competitor. The directors absolutely demand that you accept the romanticized image of these men holding court in immaculate, Victorian wallpapered casinos filled with elegantly dressed women and pristine green felt poker tables, completely ignoring the hyper-realistic, unvarnished 35mm nightmare that was the actual frontier saloon. The true boomtown watering holes were not glamorous casinos. They were horrific, disease-ridden canvas tents or hastily constructed, uninsulated wooden shacks that reeked overwhelmingly of unwashed human bodies, rotting horse manure, and stale vomit, where the floor was simply packed dirt covered in a layer of filthy sawdust specifically designed to soak up the constant, localized flow of human blood, chewing tobacco spit, and spilled alcohol. And they expect you to swallow the absurd, physics-defying fairy tale that a cinematic hero could casually order a glass of fine whiskey, elegantly toss it back, and engage in a witty, high-stakes poker game with a clear head, entirely omitting the terrifying, chemical thermodynamics of frontier alcohol production. The isolated, desperate nature of these makeshift towns meant that authentic, barrel-aged whiskey was a mathematically impossible luxury, so the local bartenders manufactured a highly toxic, localized poison colloquially known as rotgut or tarantula juice, a horrifying chemical concoction made by mixing raw grain alcohol with localized river water, chewing tobacco for color, fiery red peppers for a simulated alcoholic burn, and literal drops of sulfuric acid or raw gunpowder to give the drink a paralyzing, kinetic kick. Consuming this volatile, industrial-grade solvent did not make a man cool, calculating, and ready for a cinematic high noon draw. It instantly plunged the human biological system into a state of violent, hallucinatory intoxication and catastrophic neurological degradation, meaning the vast majority of legendary frontier shootouts were not cold, calculated chess matches between highly trained marksmen, but pathetic, incredibly clumsy, point-blank scrambling matches between heavily armed men who were legally, chemically, and biologically blind drunk, desperately firing their weapons in a localized fog of extreme nausea and failing motor skills. This same sanitized, Hollywood distortion completely infects our understanding of the military logistics that defined the Plains Indian Wars, relentlessly selling the public the noble, visually striking myth of the hopelessly outnumbered United States cavalry bravely defending themselves with superior, state-of-the-art government technology against a massive, primitive horde of Native American warriors armed only with bows, arrows, and stone-tipped spears. The brutal, unyielding economic and logistical truth of the 1870s was that the federal government was operating under massive, post-Civil War budget cuts, forcing the Ordnance Department to equip their frontline cavalry units with the Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor, a painfully slow, single-shot rifle that utilized incredibly cheap, fundamentally flawed copper ammunition casings. When these terrified soldiers were thrust into the chaotic, blindingly violent meat grinder of engagements like the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the sustained, localized heat of rapid combat firing caused those cheap copper casings to violently expand and completely fuse to the inside of the hot steel chamber, mathematically guaranteeing a catastrophic mechanical failure that forced the soldiers to frantically attempt to pry the jammed brass out of their only means of survival with the tip of a pocket knife while taking heavy incoming fire. And the incoming fire they were taking was not primitive. It was a devastating, mathematically overwhelming wall of modern, heavy-caliber ballistics, because the Native American warriors were completely unhindered by bureaucratic government procurement contracts and simply utilized their localized economic leverage to purchase the absolute bleeding edge of industrialized repeating firearms from private, profit-driven frontier traders. The warriors who rode against Custer's financially crippled, single-shot cavalry were heavily armed with blisteringly fast, high-capacity lever-action Henry and Winchester repeating rifles, creating a terrifying, asymmetrical kinetic reality where the so-called primitive forces possessed an absolute, localized, multi-directional superiority of overwhelming mechanical firepower, completely shattering the cinematic illusion of the technologically superior cavalry and proving that their expanding American empire was frequently outgunned, outmaneuvered, and mathematically slaughtered by indigenous forces who perfectly understood the ruthless, uncompromising mechanics of the frontier arms race. Furthermore, we must completely dismantle the visually iconic, Hollywood-manufactured trope of the heroic last stand, the deeply ingrained narrative requirement where a surrounded cowboy or a wounded soldier bravely fights to the absolute last drop of blood, completely expending all of his ammunition before engaging the enemy in a glorious, slow-motion, hand-to-hand cinematic death. The hardened, ruthlessly pragmatic survivors who actually rode the unforgiving Badlands mathematically understood that the concept of a glorious death was a complete, biological absurdity designed by men safely sitting in comfortable eastern armchairs, and their absolute, primary tactical doctrine in the face of overwhelming odds was not to stand their ground, but to initiate a frantic, violently desperate, high-speed retreat. If a posse, a cavalry patrol, or an outlaw syndicate was ambushed and realized they lacked the kinetic leverage to achieve instantaneous victory, they did not politely form a defensive perimeter to die like heroes. They immediately broke formation, violently whipped their horses into a terrified frenzy, abandoned their heavy supplies, and scattered into the deep brush, prioritizing absolute biological survival over any abstract, cinematic concept of honor or bravery. The frontier was conquered by men who knew exactly when to run away, men who mathematically calculated that living in complete cowardice to fight another day was infinitely more valuable than leaving a beautiful, heroic corpse to rot under the unforgiving desert sun. And finally, we must completely tear down the ultimate, sanitized hallucination of frontier medicine, the ridiculous, comforting Hollywood scene where a local, kindly town doctor effortlessly extracts a heavy lead slug from a hero's shoulder using a pair of clean silver forceps, pours a splash of whiskey over the wound as a miraculous, instantaneous antiseptic, and wraps it in a pristine white bandage, guaranteeing a full recovery by the very next scene. The absolute, horrifying microbiological reality of the 19th century is that the germ theory of disease was barely understood and completely mocked by the vast majority of frontier practitioners, meaning the man digging into your shattered shoulder with unwashed, blood-caked iron tools had likely just finished performing an autopsy on a cholera victim or tending to a gangrenous horse without once washing his hands or boiling his instruments. Pouring a shot of localized, contaminated saloon whiskey over a massive, unjacketed lead-wound channel filled with microscopic fragments of unwashed denim and pulverized bone did absolutely nothing to halt the immediate, catastrophic onset of raging staphylococcal infections, It simply burned the exposed nerve endings while the localized tissue necrosis silently accelerated, mathematically guaranteeing that the true killer on the American frontier was not the immediate kinetic impact of a .45 caliber slug, but the agonizing, slow-motion biological apocalypse of septicemia that inevitably followed the cinematic fade to black. We look back at this dark, brutal history not to completely strip away the undeniable courage of the individuals who lived it, but to aggressively rescue their true, unvarnished legacy from the sanitized, mathematically impossible fairy tales manufactured by a modern entertainment complex that is absolutely terrified of raw, uncompromising reality. The rusted iron, the jammed copper casings, the shattered bones, and the desperate, cowardly retreats into the dark are the authentic, undeniable physical receipts of an era where human survival was an agonizing, daily calculation of applied physics and biological endurance, and by refusing to look away from the grime, the blood, and the mechanical failures, we finally honor the true, horrifying, and magnificently brutal reality of the men and women who actually held the line against the absolute, crushing weight of the untamed American darkness.